Because like I said last week, this is a done deal 10-mark area coming in the exam hall. So I could just speed run and go away. But from the scripts that we received and some of the answers that some of you provided, it's actually not encouraging. It's not encouraging. So some of you still have problem with the ethics. That is why I said if care is not taken and you are not guided properly, some of you get 0 from that 10-mark question. In your mind, you will think you are writing what you're supposed to write, but you get 0 from it. Then if you are lucky, you get 2/10. But that is not a good place to be, because ethics is an area that if you really understand the scope of the context of the question, you can actually get all the marks relating to it. So number one, last week we established some principles. I want to re-establish the principles so you understand. And, you know, I'm trying to take my time in some of these things very well, because it's not just about, yeah, I finished teaching the ethics, let's go to another topic. No. If you can't answer that question, then it's not worth it. So we want to establish some principles. Number one, last week we said something. We said if the question says that, how should the accountant behave not to breach the fundamental code of ethics, then we're going to be writing our answers by looking at the fundamental code of ethics and contextualize our answers in these 5 code of ethics. So you saw that the way we answered the questions in relation to FIJA Limited. So we looked at the 5 code of ethics: integrity, professional competence, and due care. And if you realize, we did not explain the code of ethics before contextualizing. No, we try to contextualize and explain it in one sentence. The reason I'm saying this is that some of you, you are writing too plenty, too many, too a lot, a dodo. You are writing a lot. 3 pages, 4 pages, mineba. Is it love letter? You're writing a lot. So we need to put you in the position where you are briefly explaining the thing, but it is straight to the point. And that perfection will come in only after practicing over a couple of questions. And it's a 10-mark area. And I want you to get majority of the 10 marks. You can get 7/10, 8/10. It's possible. But some of the scripts that you sent to me, we cannot get that. So you have to be careful and be mindful about the context of the question. Last week, James asked a question, which I answered, but I think you didn't pay attention to it, so you were still committing the same errors. If you remember last week, James asked a question that, what if the examiner asked you to explain the ethical issues? Whose perspective do you write from? And I answered that question and said that it depends on the context of the question. If the examiner is quiet and says that, what is the ethical issue in the scenario, then you have to raise all ethical issues in the scenario without specifying. But in the question of Bolgatanga, majority of you were trying to write it from the perspective of the newly appointed chartered accountant. But that is not what the question said. The question didn't say, what are the ethical issues faced by the newly appointed chartered accountants? That's not the question. The question was, discuss the ethical issues arising from the information provided, which means you have to write from everybody's perspective in the question, not one person. So that is another thing you have to be mindful of. that when the question says, discuss the ethical issues from the above scenario, whoever is involved, from the CEO to the finance director, to the board, to any related party, everything, you must write about it. Don't select the accountant and just write about the accountant when the question said, discuss the ethical issues in the scenario. That's the second principle I want you to take here. So principle number one, when the question says, how should a professional act not to breach the code of ethics? We said you pick the fundamental code of ethics and contextualize your answer into the definition of it. Like the question we solved in FIJA, refer back to it and look at the way we solved that. Principle number two, when the question said, discuss the ethical issues from the scenario provided, you don't contextualize. You have to write from everybody's perspective in the question. Don't pick sides and just write on the accountant. Principle number three that we want to establish is that if the examiner said, what is the ethical issues faced by the accountant in the above scenario, then the examiner is clear. He said by the accountant. So in such third scenario, you are going to just write the ethical dilemma, the threats that the person is faced with, and the fundamental code of ethics that are being breached in the scenario. And that is all. So you have to understand the context of the question and the perspective from which you are supposed to write your answers. If not, you will get 0 in the exam hall. You get 0. At most, you get 2. But that is not what we want. Number 4, write your answers from the third person perspective. Because some of you were using the word I will, because in the question they said you are appointed or you are a newly appointed. No. You don't necessarily have to say, I will, I must. You have to write from the third person perspective. The newly appointed accountant should, the newly appointed accountant must, the newly appointed accountant is faced with, the newly appointed accountant, da, 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 da. So you don't do I, myself, we, that. No. Yeah. You know they need. Because you are writing as a professional and the examiner just want to personalize the scenario for you. But your answer doesn't have to be personalized or personified in terms of I. So, and some of you committed this error. So right from the third person's perspective, the newly appointed accountant, the professional accountant, that kind of thing, he should, that kind of thing. Are you getting the idea? So that is the thing I want you to understand. So I said a third person perspective because I is first person, you is second person, he, him, the newly professional accountant is a third person. So your answers must be written in the third person perspective. Okay? So please, I want you to pay attention to these things very well. So number one, when they said ethical, how the person should act, take the fundamental code of ethics, contextualize. Number two, if the question says, what are the ethical issues in the scenario, do not specify or write from just the perspective of the professional accountant. Write from whatever ethical issues is in the question and whoever is going to be affected. Number three, if the question says, what is the ethical dilemma faced by the accountant in the scenario, then hell yes, you have to be specific. Number four, write your answers always from the third person perspective. No I, no we, no must. The professional accountant, he should. The finance director, the CEO, the third person perspective. The third person perspective. Another thing that I want us to also cement here technically will be the issue relating to the write-up. Some of you were over-explaining yourself. And I said this in the introduction. You were over-explaining yourself. You were just regurgitating. You were writing a lot. We don't have time in the exam hall to write plenty like that. Go straight to the point, hit it, tell us what the heck you want to say, and we move. Okay? So, and I wrote comments in almost all your scripts. A lot of you, I get, not almost all, but a lot of you, I wrote comments in your script. So learn to be brief, but also detailed enough for us to understand what you are writing. And like I said, that will come after practices. If not, the ethics, you will likely get 0 or maybe 2/10. Because in your head, you think you are writing the points, but in actual sense, it is not making any sense. Are you getting it? So these are some of the things that I want us to really, really establish about how we approach ethics questions. And I want you to get this once and for all, so that in another question, you know, ask yourself, okay, what is the question saying? Whose perspective am I supposed to write from? Did the question say who I should write about? How am I supposed to put this down? How do I briefly put my points across so I don't have to write a lot? Are you getting it? So these are some of the things that I want you to be really mindful of about ethics. And it's a 10-mark area. So I really want you to know how to really play around this and obtain majority of the marks ultimately in the exam hall. Okay. Any questions, please?